Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. In today's episode, I'm actually going to recommend you watch What Do You Meme's video on this subject instead of mine, because I will be refuting Mr. Cosmic's view on biblical slavery, but What Do You Meme did a much better job refuting this video. So I'm just going to tell you right now, stop watching this video, go to the description, and click the link for What Do You Meme's video. You'll thank me later. Well, if you're still here, I guess let's begin.
So, on to the video.
Hey everyone, my name is Alan Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. Here on The Beat, we release a new video every single Tuesday, and today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
So this should be our first cause for concern. The video begins by suggesting that we're about to hear an argument that the Bible doesn't support slavery, and yet we're now being readied for, instead of, here is proof, unequivocal proof, that the Bible condemns slavery, rather something more like, well, slavery is supported in the Bible, but it's a special kind of slavery that isn't all that bad. Obviously, this hasn't been explicitly said yet, but I want you to pay attention to the language being used here. Consider this question throughout the video. Are we being offered proof that the Bible does not justify slavery? Or are we being offered an excuse for the fact that it does?
Well, that depends on how you define slavery. It's clear from the context of the video that The Beat is referring specifically to the type of slavery that was in America when he asked the question, does the Bible support slavery? The problem that he would make is that he doesn't clarify that there are 3 different types of slavery in the Bible, or servanthood. One for the Hebrews, which the Cosmic Skeptic keeps harping on him about. One for servants bought from other nations. And one for conquests of war, which doesn't come up a whole lot in this video, and when it does, Mr. Cosmic strawmans it. Now, this lack of distinction does lend himself to criticism from the Cosmic Skeptic, which I do not think is completely unfounded, but to draw the conclusion that the Bible supports the kind of slavery held in America is completely unwarranted. Let's continue.
It does.
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather He regulated it.
Okay, would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind? Perhaps, but it's an important point. God did in fact invent the concept of the ownership of human beings, since he himself has an absolute right and authority over our lives. This is, of course, not the kind of slavery being discussed in the video, but if anything, this even more undeniable type of slavery propagated in the Bible is even worse than the kind apparent in the slave trade. At least when owned by a human being, there's always a chance of redemption, changes in the law, escaping to freedom, or at the very least death, if it's decided that no life is better than one spent in bondage. This is all possible in something like the slave trade. Not so much with the ownership of human beings by God. There is no escape. There is no chance of a change in the law. There is no appeal, and there is no death. Now, I can already hear you. Alex, don't be such a melodramatic Hitchens impersonator. God isn't a slave owner. Slave owners don't offer their slaves a chance to access paradise, and they certainly don't give them a choice. They chain them up and whip them into forced labor. God gives his subjects a choice. They're able to follow him or not, as they please. So what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity. Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
Well, that's a bit of a pedantic response. It would have been more accurate for the beat if he had, instead of saying God did not create slavery, he should have said God did not command slavery. But Mr. Cosmic is a smart fellow. He should have known this. But instead, he went off on a false analogy, comparing God to a slaver. My iPhone is not my slave. Even if my phone gained artificial intelligence, it still would not be my slave, but it would still be my phone.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery.
Okay, stop. Yes, the Bible contains laws regulating murder, theft, polygamy, and divorce. But here's an important question. What are these regulations exactly? Well, let's see. The regulations on murder are don't do it. The regulations on theft are don't do it. Polygamy, divorce, yeah, don't do it. The laws regulating these things were not regulations, but explicit condemnations. Exodus 20:15, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not steal." This leaves no room for confusion, and I wouldn't dream of arguing that the Bible endorses theft. I'll repeat, the only appropriate regulation on slavery is its abolition. Anything less than this, at the very least, demonstrates that God doesn't feel as strongly about it as he does, say, divorce or adultery. "Thou shalt not claim ownership of other human beings" is nowhere to be found in the pronouncements at Sinai or in any of the books that follow it. Why not?
Because there is nothing inherently wrong with owning people as property. What is important is how you treat them. The laws against murder and theft do not regulate murder and theft. They regulate people and how they treat other people. Of course, this is all very ironic since Mr. Cosmic believes morality is subjective. So who is he to say that the only appropriate regulation on slavery is abolition? If morality is subjective, you can't say that's the only option.
So he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
Ensure the proper treatment of slaves. Again, I'll press this. The only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this. There were no laws making sure that the victims of theft were properly treated. People were simply told not to do it. Proper treatment of slaves is a contradiction in terms.
Again, I'll press this. If morality is subjective, you have no foundation on which to claim
the only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this.
Slaves were not victims of slavery. Mr. Cosmic's making a clear equivocation fallacy here by equivocating slavery in the Bible with slavery in America, which is exactly what the beat is arguing against, so Mr. Cosmic is begging the question. Mr. Cosmic would need to provide some sort of justification why he thinks it's wrong to own people as property. But of course he does not do this, and even if he did, any attempt to do so would violate his views that morality is subjective.
Number two, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see, was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years. This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional. So in other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves, or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt. Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional.
Okay, so there's a lot there, and there's some level of truth to this, but let's actually analyze one of the most explicit references to slavery made in the Bible to see what we're really dealing with. Atheists are quick to point to chapters like Leviticus 25 to prove that the Bible condones slavery, so let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter. "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. That last point, by the way, about the Israelites highlights the tribalism of the Bible, since it's condoning slavery, but only when the slaves are taken from other nations.
It says they can buy their servants from the nations around them, not take them. And of course, any slaves bought by Israel would have been treated far better than wherever they were bought from. For more detailed information on this, and other reasons why Mr. Cosmic is just wrong, then go ahead and read Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. There's a lot more in that book than I could ever try and explain in one of my videos.
What else can we take from this excerpt? Well, take note of the language used to describe the slaves. Quote, "They will become your property." Even if someone is treated well, there's no excuse for considering a human being as property. One of the many reasons this is such a disgusting practice is that property is inheritable. And as the 46th verse here says, the slaves mentioned in this part of the Bible can be inherited by the children of the original owner. And you can, quote, "make them slaves for life." If God is giving the Israelites authority to indefinitely enslave people of other nations and make them slaves for life, these people were not simply workers or in some kind of voluntary dependent relationship agreement. They're not free to leave. This is outrageous, regardless of how they're being treated.
Again, Mr. Cosmic makes no justification for why he thinks it's wrong to own people as property. He tries to say it's wrong because property can be inherited, but he doesn't explain what's wrong with being inherited. And another thing with that verse is it says you can bequeath them to your children. You can make them slaves for life, which would imply that you can treat them according to the law of inheritance and the law of making them a slave for life. But of course, that reading may only apply to that translation. There are other translations he could have used that would prevent that interpretation. But I presume he used this translation because it's the same one the Beat was using. Anyway, Paul Copan in Is God a Moral Monster has a lot more to say about this. I'm finding it very difficult to pull quotes from that book right now, but he does make the case that they are not forced to be slaves for literally their whole life. They can make money and even have their own servants. Would you actually consider a slave who has servants a slave?
But even if we ignore this and only talk about the Hebrew servants mentioned in Exodus 21, we've still got problems. How were these servants treated? Well, let's take a look at one of these regulations, shall we? Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21. And this verse comes just after the one the guy quoted in the video regarding Hebrew servants. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance? Even if we grant that the slavery being talked about here is more like a kind of employer-employee situation, this would be an unacceptable way to treat any employee. Imagine if your boss could beat you as much as he wanted as long as you didn't die. It's ridiculous. You, Mr. Videomaker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime. The regulations of slavery in the Bible are exactly what you'd expect from a book that refers to these slaves as property. They're awful, indefensible, superstitious idiocy that deserve the same historical condemnation as the legalities surrounding the slave trade in the USA.
Oh, poor Mr. Cosmic. We've seen in an earlier video that he does not have the best reading comprehension when it comes to Exodus. First of all, this does not necessarily apply to just Hebrew servants. Hebrew servants are mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, but then the chapter moves on to other subjects. Starting at verse 12, it switches over to the death penalty and starts listing reasons for people to be executed, among which is accidentally killing your servant by beating him to death. But he is no longer his servant. If you just go down a little further and read verse 26 and 27. And if a man smite the eye of his servant or the eye of his maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. And if he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. In other words, if you damage your servant's eye, nay, even their tooth, they will go free. The pain and loss they just suffered is worth whatever debt they owed. So, rather than reading the verse in context, Mr. Cosmic has constructed a straw man and proudly proclaimed that that straw man is indefensible.
And this is still only in reference to Hebrew slaves. Elsewhere in the Bible, we see what's condoned when enslaving people from foreign nations, such as the Midianites. In Numbers chapter 31, verses 17 to 18, Moses instructs the following: "Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, what use could these men possibly have for keeping all the virgin girls, quote, for themselves? I wonder. Why aren't we seeing a defense of verses like this, condoning not just slavery, but sexual slavery?
Whoa. Who said anything about sex slaves? Nowhere in that chapter does it mention anything about sex slaves. This is a prime example of eisegesis instead of exegesis. Mr. Cosmic is reading his own perverted ideas into the text instead of actually reading it out of the text. The text does not make any claims of forced copulation. Any fornication outside of marriage was not allowed, and rape was punishable by death.
Which leads me to my fourth point, which is that kidnapping, according to Exodus chapter 21, in any and all circumstances was completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And so this idea that you could take somebody against their will and make them your slave was not only against the law, but it was outside of the will of God.
Okay, this all depends on translation. This guy seems to be using the New International Version of the Bible. But, for instance, the King James Bible, in the verse just quoted, doesn't say that you can't kidnap people, it says that you can't stealeth them. I'd wager that it makes little sense to outline all of the regulations on slavery that we've just talked about in the Bible, and then say here that you can't take slaves. Because of this, it seems that this verse is saying that you can't steal a man who is either rightfully free or who belongs to somebody else already. Why else would there be so many laws around slavery if there really was just this simple condemnation of it elsewhere in the Bible? Also, we're dealing with an ambiguity here surrounding whether this verse applies to all people or just to Hebrews, since this is preceded by a verse that specifies that it's talking about Hebrews. We've already seen how easily God can condone kidnapping people from other nations, especially conquered nations, and not just for employment, but for something as trivial as carnal desire.
This clip is so cringe, I don't even know where to start. Well, I guess the beginning will do. So first he says it's a matter of translation, and apparently he's a King James only person now. He doesn't bring in any other translations to try and compare them and see what God actually said, but then he seems to misunderstand what kidnapping is. Kidnapping is stealing a person. And Mr. Cosmic is purposely or conveniently forgetting that the main argument that the Beat is putting forth is that most of the slavery in Israel was voluntary, and the fact that kidnapping was illegal proves it. Then he tries to insinuate that the verse is maybe talking about just Hebrews, but I already covered that in the last clip. It mentions Hebrews in verse 1, then changes subjects later. Starting at verse 12, it starts talking about what is deserving of the death penalty, and the verse in question in this clip is verse 16. Then he makes an unjustified assertion that the Bible condones kidnapping from other nations. He gives no reference for that. I dare you, find a verse that actually condones kidnapping people from other nations. And I'm not talking about conquered nations, because Mr. Cosmic specified, especially conquered nations. So they're separate issues. So now, are the conquered people kidnapped. They are prisoners of war. So for all intents and purposes, they were arrested, not kidnapped. And he ends it with the same unsubstantiated claim he made in the last clip. Israel did not take sex slaves.
5, slavery was limited to just 6 years, and so the idea here is that it was never God's heart for the rich to overtake or control the poor. On the contrary, this system was set up so that slaves or people who were in debt could work off their debt in a safe and loving environment.
Safe and loving environment. Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result.
A safe and loving environment.
Mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want.
How about a little fire, Scarecrow?
Number 6, slave owners were to treat slaves with respect. The Bible says in Leviticus chapter 25 that slave owners were commanded to treat slaves as employees or hired workers in terms of the type of work that they gave them.
Okay, here's the full verse. If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and sell themselves to you, do not make them work as slaves. They are to be treated as hired workers. So we're seeing a rather boring trend here, which is, once again, picking Bible verses that are referring to the wrong people.
And this is the part where I partially agree with Mr. Cosmic. The Beat does indeed do a poor job of differentiating between Israelite servants and foreign servants, which can make his argument seem a bit non sequitur. But all the laws pertaining to how you treat your servants still apply. The only caveat is that Israelite servants can't be truly permanent. The entire chapter of Leviticus 25 is about the year of Jubilee, where everybody gets returned to their own possessions. And this may even apply to the servant who chose to remain permanent servant and had the awl put in his ear. The real question is, what does it mean to treat a slave harshly or with rigor, as it says in a later verse? We know this can't mean you can beat your slaves if you can treat them harshly or with rigor, because then they just go free. It could be, perhaps, that with rigor or treat harshly could just mean that they don't get set free in the year of Jubilee, especially since the entire chapter is about the year of Jubilee. But I could be wrong. I don't know ancient Hebrew.
Not only this, but if a slave owner was guilty of killing a slave, he would be facing severe punishment himself.
So he just put up on the screen the verse we were talking about earlier about punishing slave owners who beat their slaves to death. But surprisingly, he fails to highlight that there's no punishment if the slave manages to get up after the beating. I wonder why this might be.
Because punishment in this context is the death penalty. If the slave revives, he gets set free. So the slave owner has lost his property. He quite literally paid for the damages.
And number 7, slavery was never based on race. And so nowhere in the Bible does it condone enslaving a race of people, rather only individuals, and that on a voluntary basis.
Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. I mean, it's literally written in black and white. And this verse is followed by the command not to do the same with the Israelites, again highlighting that the slaves we should be concerned about are not the ones that this guy keeps trying to use to defend his position. A verse that says, take slaves from other nations, but not from yours, is inherently racist. There's no way around it.
There will always be a difference between a natural-born citizen and a foreigner. There is nothing inherently racist about that. Tell me, Mr. Cosmic, do you think it's racist that the President of America has to be an American? If you do not have any discernible difference between a natural-born citizen and a foreigner, then you don't even have a nation.
But let's be more explicit. I referenced this earlier, this chapter, but go ahead and read chapter 31 from the book of Numbers. In the New International Version of the Bible, this has a subheading that reads, Vengeance on the Midianites, and tells of how God instructed Moses to slaughter the Midianites and to take their women as sex slaves. This was a conquest based entirely on race.
And Mr. Cosmic ends the video by refuting himself. He mentions the subheading said, "Vengeance on the Midianites." And for some reason, he claims this vengeance is racist. How exactly is vengeance supposed to be racist? And for the third time in this video, he tries to mention sex slaves where there are none. Now, it's been a while since I've seen What Do You Mean's rebuttal to this video, so I don't know how closely I match it, and I didn't want to rewatch it because I want to make my own arguments, not take someone else's. But seriously, if you have not watched What Do You Mean's rebuttal to Mr. Cosmic's video, go watch it. It is in the description.